So let's begin. Today I have with me Greg Lawson, who's an expert on U.S. foreign policy, and he will be discussing with me today about the Trump administration and the Trump administration 2.0 foreign policy, looking into aspects such as their goals, but also about what are the drivers and the ideological aspects of the new administration from that perspective. So, Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Really glad to be on here and discussing this. I know a lot of people are probably trying to figure everything out. It's a very different look for the United States here in just a very short period of time, a very dramatic shift. And of course, President Trump he's a very American figure, but I think that actually is what makes it so sometimes challenging for folks who aren't as familiar with a lot of the various domestic strands of policy, politics, cultural angles, stuff like that. That all has helped lead to the point where he has been elected. And actually, in this last one, he was elected with the majority vote. So this wasn't just an electoral college victory, one of the quirks of American elections. This was a straight up victory in the popular vote as well.
So great. Let maybe start with that. What is the administration goals? What are they trying to achieve? What is it that they are looking to accomplish in the next 4 years of their ruling?
It's pretty clear that President Trump recognizes that he's only got one term left because he obviously served. He's the second president in U.S. history to be elected to non-consecutive terms. So that makes him pretty unique in American history. He knows his time is short, and it's pretty clear that he's ambitious and he's trying to move things forward in his vision of what would make America great again. And I think it's an interesting throwback, in a sense, to some previous administrations. And he's made very explicit some of the throwbacks to American figures that may have been lost to a lot of folks outside the country, because when we think about American history, we a lot of times think about the Cold War presidents or Ronald Reagan or, certainly the most recent presidents. But he has touched on figures like William McKinley, who was a president in the late 1800s during the Spanish-American War. He's mentioned apparently James K. Polk, which is a president that I'm sure a lot of people outside of the United States don't know much about. In fact, I'm not sure a lot of Americans even have as much of an appreciation, because he was a one-term president in the mid 1800s, actually earlier 1800s, who was president during the Mexican-American War in the, I believe, the 1840s. And the President Trump has again name dropped these folks. He name dropped McKinley in his inauguration speech. He has actually put a portrait. He asked the Speaker of the House to switch portraits of one of Thomas Jefferson that was in the White House, and asked for a portrait of James K. Polk to be moved from the Capitol into the White House, which is a interesting signal, I think, in terms of what the president's mindset is, which is, I think he does see some degree of more control, of not necessarily going to be unclear whether he literally wants to physically take over all this territory, but it's clear that he seeks to exert political control, if not de jure control, over various things that he thinks are in the national interest. So he is very much a throwback to a more realpolitik, more old school pre-World War, kind of pre-rules based order sort of mentality.
So I think it's an interesting point, and I want to take it from there, because you mentioned the portrait of President Polk, and also before me and you had a discussion about President McKinley and the mountain, one of the highest mountains in the world. There was a mountain in Alaska which was called McKinley Mountain, and then they changed the name to the native name. And the reason why I'm mentioning that, because it looks like someone who doesn't know President Trump, or actually, I would say the opposite. Those who know him from his television characteristics, from his from the I would say the PR that he doesn't seem like a very intellectual, ideological person. He seemed more intuitive. He seemed more of a business kind of approach, a very well Wall Street type of guy, you could say. But then you have those kind of things that kind of hint that there's a side of him which is more ideological. more looking at things from a policy perspective that has roots in ideological strong foundation. So maybe you can take it from there and explain what is the ideology that you think this new administration is trying to push compared to other administrations that were before him.
I think the biggest one is that, again, as I mentioned before, I think this is a bit of a throwback to sort of how the world operated pre-World War in the pre-World War era. And I think President Trump sort of sees the world as in that lens. He doesn't really buy into the rules-based order. He doesn't really think that that is an operative thing. He thinks the world is more Hobbesian in that sense. I mentioned realpolitik, and I wouldn't characterize him as intellectual in the sense of that he studied, international relations theory and read John Mearsheimer or Kenneth Waltz or
No.
the IR folks, but I think he essentially intuits some of that. And that is a very different phenomenon. I mean, in some sense, the most recent president that I think he's closest to, although there's a lot of personality differences and things like that, is probably Nixon. But it's as opposed to Nixon being more intellectual, this is that instinctual basis. But he, I think, sees the world as a competitive place. He grew up, in New York. He was a real estate developer. And it's interesting because I think that also influences things. If you think about New York as kind of, they used to call it sort of the concrete jungle, it's a very difficult place to do business. There's a lot of things you have to do with unions to get buildings built. There's a lot of challenges with public officials and zoning, and how do you navigate a somewhat tumultuous, difficult process. But it's also a very kind of aggressive place where you have to kind of win a dog eat dog sort of business environment. And that's what he grew up in. His father was a real estate developer. He grew up under that. He was quoted in magazine articles back in the 1980s talking about man being the most vicious animal of all, essentially. So he really is almost the id of a Hobbesian perspective. And so it's not surprising that he sort of goes back to a pre-rules based order in terms of his mentality. It's sort of that instinctual experience that he had in his whole career up to when he became such a big celebrity. And he's always been a pretty big pop culture figure in America for decades, well before he ran for president, and even frankly, well before he was on The Apprentice and all the things like that, which I think are what a lot of people probably know him from more recently before he ran for president. But he was a big figure before. And again, I think it's really important to understand that sort of neo-Hobbesian view that sort of permeates his perspective. And I think that is it would have been much more understandable in the 1800s and the early 1900s. But I think that's a perspective that has largely not been the views of presidents, certainly since the World Wars. So it's a throwback. But what's interesting about all this is it's not actually un-American. It's very much a deep-seated strain of America. It's just a deep-seated strain of America that is an older strain that has for many, many years been sort of obscured by more contemporary developments. So this is almost like an excavation back in time. And I think in that sense, Trump is almost a throwback figure in his perspective on things.
And how do you see the way that he surrounded himself with individuals such as J.D. Vance, for example, as vice president? A lot of people say it's first and foremost loyalists, people who will do what they basically are asked to do because they're loyalists. But it seems that there's also some ideological stands into those elections of those individuals. So how do you see the kind of the beehive that surrounds him in terms of the decision making that he's doing right now?
Sure. Well, first of all, this is a very different administration here in the second term than it was in the first time around. He has certainly surrounded himself with a combination of things, and you hit the nail on the head. They are definitely loyalists. That's definitely true, but they are more in line with his vision. They're not just they are loyalists to him on a personal level, and he definitely prizes that very, very much, and he has throughout his whole career. That said, and he recognizes, by the way, too, that he had people that weren't loyal to him in the first administration, and that actually caused him a great deal of problems in terms of getting things done. And I think he feels that he was betrayed, frankly, by a lot of significant figures, even national security advisors, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. I mean, Trump clearly felt like he was being hobbled in a sense by people in his own administration. So I think he was very clear that that's not what he wanted. But it's loyalty, but there is a philosophical underpinning here. And I think, in particular, Vice President Vance is really the kind of canary in the coal mine, as they say, because Vance was actually, and early on, he was an opponent of President Trump. In 2016, Vance is well quoted, and there's been a lot of coverage about Vance's take on Trump, but he's switched his opinion. And in this case, I actually happen to know the vice president a little bit, and have spent some time talking to him because I'm from Ohio, which is where he was a U.S. senator. So, I've had the chance to have some fairly significant conversations, and I can say that he is a very philosophical individual. He's a very intellectual. One of the more, I would actually say, maybe one of the more intellectual vice presidents we've had in recent memory. And so he has really is putting, I think, more meat on the bones. You've got Trump's instincts, and I think that he's driven very much by instinct, much more than reflection and reading and things of that nature. Vance is the kind of the opposite in a sense. He is much more of an intellect. He is engaged with a lot of different ideas, both on social issues, which he is very prominent in certain social conservative circles, what we would characterize in America as pro-family values circles. He's a relatively recent convert to Catholicism, and he has taken that very seriously in Vance. But he has taken a lot of Trump's instincts, and he's starting to kind of put them into a somewhat, I would argue, more coherent sort of package on a philosophical basis. And I think that President Trump picked him partly for that. Now, truth be told, Vance also befriended Donald Trump Jr. J.D. Vance also was friends and had worked with Peter Thiel, major Silicon Valley figure, and Thiel has historically been a supporter of President Trump. He was a supporter in the first term, so there were some connections that played a role in that as well. But I think while the president has not said that Vance is inherently going to be the successor, I think a lot of people have the assumption that he is going to be, and that he is going to be the one who takes the ideas of Trump and continues to sort of mold them on a forward-leaning basis to sort of codify and put deep roots into the whole "Make America Great Again" sort of concept.
And I think one of the most interesting points is that, and I think it's a little bit, I would say, lost in the noise a little bit, and not getting enough attention, is that the new administration ideology translate to policy when it comes to looking at South America and Latin America in a different way than other administrations. And because we were looking into aspects such as China, the tariffs, the Middle East, that aspect a little bit is lost. But we also see that he's looking into, for example, the name change of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. For a lot of people, it's kind of a joke, but there is, again, an ideological aspect into it, regaining that ownership, so to speak. And the second one is appointing Marco Rubio as basically Secretary of State, first Latin Secretary of State, who is also comes from a family of immigrants from Latin America, and so on. So what can you tell us about what do you see this kind of policy towards South America, Latin America change that we see with this new administration?
Couple of points there. I think the first point is that in the early days of America and the early days of America's kind of rise to great power status and expansion back in the 1800s, Mexico and Latin America were obviously the key thing. I mean, European great powers were generally fighting each other, and then there was the expansion, the manifest destiny portion of America. But Latin America was critical, and it continues to be critical. I mean, it was so critical that there was the thing called the Monroe Doctrine, which was essentially a statement in the early days of America that was saying, Europe and other powers stay out of our basically Western hemisphere. Don't use your own gunboat diplomacy. This is our territory. It was a very, in a sense, spheres of influence sort of perspective. And that was definitely there. Teddy Roosevelt then did a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine when he was president, and he was kind of a hardcore realist, building out the Navy, power projection, but he was a very big believer as well in basically American control and dominance of the Western Hemisphere. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt was the president who essentially helped facilitate the creation of the Panama Canal because he recognized Panama and really helped Panama become an independent nation for the express purpose of being able to build the canal because Colombia wouldn't do it. That's the history of the Panama Canal. And I think what you're seeing here is with that throwback mentality I was talking about before, there's a recognition that you got to tend to your own backyard. And there's been a lot of movement, particularly China, into South America and influence in certainly Venezuela, but also Brazil. And of course, there's been this big concern about Chinese companies and port companies controlling the ports along the Panama Canal, which is a real concern from a strategic standpoint that you have another great power, a potential regional hegemon in their own region playing in your own backyard. So I think there is a desire here to reassert what was historically focused on as the Monroe Doctrine, but it's something that had been lost a lot in contemporary discourse because there wasn't the kind of competition in the backyard. It was sort of assumed that America kind of was the most influential portion there, and then there was also some philosophical elements that sort of downplayed the hard power elements of it for a while. And I think Trump is certainly a reversion back to hard power, realpolitik, frankly, spheres of influence sort of approach to things. So he wants to get that there, more influence there, block China from being able to have too much influence. And then the other piece to it is the instability of some of the countries in Central and South America have led to some of the migrant trains and chains and things like that that have come up through Mexico and have started to become the border problem. And that was probably the two biggest issues that got President Trump elected was the border issue, the lack of border security, and the hollowing out of America's manufacturing. And so getting a grip and getting some more control and putting pressure on Mexico to prevent major flows of folks and immigrants coming in is very important to fulfilling campaign promises. And actually, it does have it has had a real impact in America. It has the illegal immigration question has had a real has created a lot of domestic turmoil politically and socially because there's a lot of issues that are kind of downstream from that. And so we have to assert more dominance here in order to control that issue. And it's become such a prominent one that we have to do it now in a way that we have sort of been putting on the back burner for the last couple of decades.
So you mentioned the whole manufacturing aspect as part of it, and one of the things that's very interesting talking to you, as you said before, you come from Ohio, which is kind of for a lot of people, it's kind of like the representation of the United States. It's always in the polls. The Ohio state is the one that kind of represent the U.S. in a whole. How much of an issue is that for this administration to bring back manufacturing back into the US? So we see that a lot of the tariffs that are being basically installed and a lot of those economic policies are aimed to that, are basically aimed with the end result of essentially building a manufacturing capacity, which the Trump administration believed was lost in the last few decades. So how much of that is critical for their foreign policy, and how much of that is a driver of their foreign policy?
Massive. I mean, absolutely massive. It's a very different mindset, obviously, again, than the last several administrations have been. And one can certainly argue about the economic merits of tariffs. There's certainly a lot of pain that happens as a result of it. And recent stock market challenges here in America, with the decline into correction territory, is an indication that tariffs can certainly be painful. That said, there's no doubt about it that the president sees tariffs as a tool that can sometimes accomplish two different things. He does sometimes use it as basically coercive diplomacy to compel countries to do things that may not directly be economic. For example, in the case of Mexico, trying to make Mexico put more troops on the border to avoid those immigration flows and to stop the influx of fentanyl, which has been a massive problem in the United States. In fact, in Ohio, I can tell you, we have parts in Ohio where we're one of the leading states for fentanyl overdose. It was essentially a reverse opium war in a lot of ways because the fentanyl came from China into Mexico. The cartels put the stuff in the product and got it across the border. So it was a real problem. But broadly speaking, the president really believes that we need to bring back domestic manufacturing. I think there's a combination of factors that do this. Some of this is that old school belief of his. He kind of grew up when manufacturing, I mean, he was kind of was a boy and a young man when manufacturing had not yet begun the hollowing out process that has subsequently took place beginning really in the 70s and 80s and on into the beginning of the 21st century, where Ohio, for example, lost several 100,000 manufacturing jobs. I mean, it was an absolutely devastating situation in Ohio, and Ohio in many ways has yet to recover from that, which is one of the reasons why has won 3 times Ohio by by very significant margins. It's not even close, actually. He's very dominant in Ohio, and so he wants to revive that. He also, I think, recognizes, as I think some of the people around him do, that supply chains for critical issues, critical construction, critical manufacturing can be shut off in times of turmoil. COVID certainly showed that. The competition now with China and the concerns of the technological competition with China certainly is creating a big challenge there. So he wants to bring it back, I think, for those strategic reasons as well as some of the nostalgic reasons that play a role. And tariffs to him are a tool to do this. If you make it so expensive to make stuff overseas, it's going to create opportunities for both American companies to reinvest here domestically. And it also, and he doesn't care if a foreign company invests in America, but he wants it to be invested in America, not overseas. He wants to literally make it so expensive that people have to bring it into America and then they don't pay anything.
And there is also something that popped up during our previous discussion, which was about the shippings and building of ships. I believe he appointed someone as Minister of Shipyards or
Mhm.
something like that, right?
Yeah. Yes, he
Uh,
mentioned that prominently in the State of the Union speech that he was going to do that because we have I think disastrous is almost too kind of a word. We used to have obviously the world's largest navy. Now China does. Where their shipbuilding capacity. Some studies have indicated that they have a shipbuilding capacity that's 200 times the United States shipbuilding capacity. 200 times. And we can quibble about whether that's technically correct or if it's a little bit less than that, but it's clearly much, much more than we have, which is I think, a very concerning dynamic for American policymakers because there's still this afterglow of America being the arsenal of democracy in World War II and being the industrial powerhouse. Well, the reality is China is now the industrial powerhouse. And America sort of voluntarily ceded its position and outsourced a lot and helped facilitate that very situation. And that has led to a lot of resentment, again, in places like Ohio, who believe that the politicians sold them out, their jobs out, and didn't just sell them out, they sold them out to who is now our number one geopolitical competitor, which is doubly insulting and dangerous. And so the shipbuilding is a huge issue. We've lost many of our shipyards. We've lost labor force. We don't. America has a much less number of people who are capable of doing this. So having a laser focus on this to be able to try to unwind some of the decline that's happened there is absolutely essential. That said, I think this isn't something where you just flip a light switch because you got to build shipyards. You've got to be able to get and this is where the tariff issue might become a bit of a problem. Of course, is that it could increase the cost of steel and the inputs, which is going to be a fascinating dynamic of you want to make people invest here, but then you also need to be able to bring in intermediate goods that you then manufacture when you get here. But if you have tariffs on everything, that makes those intermediate goods more, which makes your own manufacturing more expensive. So that kind of cuts against some of what you're trying to do. So it gets really complicated when you think about the economics. But it's clear that at least they're looking at it, and that they're looking at it in a way that I don't think a previous administration this century, in the 21st century, has really done because they recognize this is a massive deficit. We're not building enough naval ships, and in some sense, we're not even building enough commercial ships. And when you think about the Arctic and the ongoing likely increasing competition in the Arctic as ice begins to melt some, but you still need icebreakers. Well, I think Russia is the country that leads the world in icebreakers right now because we can't even build those. And yet, we obviously want to have access to the resources that are in the Arctic. And so we really have got a lot of deficits in our manufacturing. And the Navy and the lack of shipyards is a big one. So this is another critical thing. And like a lot of things, I think President Trump actually understands the American problems in a way. I think there's been decades where American policymakers essentially bought into Fukuyama-esque sort of end of history, comparative advantage in economics, and forgot that while that works in the abstract and in theory, and the theory is correct, the problem is that in a world where you have geopolitical competition and your largest trading partners might be your enemy in a war someday, that does change things. That's the reality on the ground versus the abstractions in an economics textbook. And I think Trump represents a throwback to recognizing those harsh realities versus some of the, I think, overly naive perspectives that a lot of leaders have been exhibiting over the last several decades.
So I think understanding the economic policy when it comes to the Trump administration and understanding that it's coming from a decision to bring back industrialization and industrialization power and capabilities back into the United States helps to explain to a lot of people what is kind of unclear right now, which is why he's installing all those tariffs. Because I think what he's doing is kind of a gradual thing. He's understanding is let's bring back those jobs, let's bring back those manufacturing capabilities. Later we can deal with the tariffs because the tariffs is something that once they're here, they're not gonna go back. So we can work it in stages. And as you say, it's a leverage to pressure on others to do so. So it kind of sets the direction, and very early on, I mean, it's a little bit hard to understand or to realize we're only less than 2 months since the administration took power. I mean, it's very early on from that perspective. You touched a point several times, and we kind of circling around this, but I think let's talk about the dragon in the room, so to speak. There is definitely a kind of a shadow over everything that the Trump administration is doing, and that is the shadow of China, the rise of China, the competition with China, the understanding that at some point there could be a military conflict, be in Taiwan or somewhere else, with the PLA. Um, how much is the new administration hawkish towards China? Because it's been 2 months, and actually on that front, it's pretty quiet. I mean, I would say my biggest surprise from this administration hasn't been anything which is related to the terrorists, because he talked about that, the approximation to Russia. That's something we'll talk about, but that pretty much were things that were discussed before. But what is different is that he's surrounding himself with China hawks, and yet we haven't seen any actions except from the tariffs that recently were imposed that kind of reflects that. So how do you explain that?
And I do think that there is, and this is going to be the potentially the biggest question, is he's certainly surrounded himself with hawks. At this administration, Rubio is a China hawk. Mike, National Security Advisor Waltz is a China hawk. He's got a number of other Pentagon officials that have either already been approved by the Senate or soon to be approved. I would anticipate that are well known, including like Elbridge Colby, who wrote a very well known book in the U.S. and circles about focusing on Taiwan and focusing on defending Taiwan in a resource constrained environment. And he's going to be basically the leading policy official within the Pentagon, assuming he gets Senate confirmation. So these are all folks who are very well on the record on China. The president, I think, is the one thing that is unclear is whether he is going to be willing to cut deals with China to buy, like, more eventually more agriculture products, which is a big market for U.S. farmers and things, especially in a place like Ohio, and what kind of deal he might want to cut there. Now, he also is, on one hand, you're right, he hasn't been quite as hawkish. On the other hand, they kind of forced the Panama government to sell put pressure on the companies that were Chinese companies that ran some of the ports. And they actually were basically sold by the Chinese company out of Hong Kong, just like in the last couple of weeks. And so there is some pressure points on things like that it appears that the administration is pushing pretty heavily on. But they're also spending a lot of money on trying to build out, again, with the Navy, which I think is mostly directed towards dealing with China. So there are still some actions that are happening, and it looks like they're going to continue to try to do additional sanctions. Whether they are effective or not is certainly an open question, but on semiconductors, high-end semiconductors, because of the race regarding AI and the need for high-end chips to be able to continue to work on data centers and the training of AI. So there's still a lot of continuity, I'd say, in that space, but it has been less than you might have anticipated, given the hawkishness of the rhetoric during the campaign. And it'll be interesting to see whether this is a sign that Trump likes the good cop, bad cop, and I think he does to some extent, and whether there's anything that Xi Jinping can put forward where he might actually be more dovish than you would initially anticipate. I think one of the biggest questions that we really aren't sure on is I think he sort of believes in spheres of influence. So the question becomes, what are those spheres of influence and where do those get demarcated? And is this really a movement? Is he trying to make a move to some extent with the Russia piece and the China piece of a sort of a modernized or 21st century concert of Europe, but more broad. There's certainly been discussions of that, and I don't know that he would think of it quite in those terms. I doubt he's read Henry Kissinger's World Restored or anything like that, which talked a lot about that. But it seems like there is a direction of policy where that is something that he appears to be kind of considering. So he may be leaving some things on the table so that he can ratchet tensions up with China, depending on what they do or don't do relative to the deals that he's wanting to eventually cut.
And it's interesting because you mentioned Russia there. We see a lot of movement in that front when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but not just from the perspective of the idea of resolving the war in Ukraine and reaching a conclusion of it, but also to some extent what some people are saying that it's kind of a Nixon in reverse, the idea of approximation to Russia in order to bring them in from the excess with China. Being difficult or not, I'm not going into that, but it seems that it's something the administration may be looking at to get in closer, warmer relations with Russia to balance what they have, at the very least, to balance what they have with China and to be on that balance as well. How do you see the Russia policy of the new administration from the perspective of how it's been perceived vis-a-vis China? How do you see that?
I think that's absolutely critical. I think that's definitely a part of what's happening here. I think there's a recognition. I think there's two parts to it. I think President Trump actually is very worried about nuclear escalation. I think he's actually very concerned about that, and he worries about that. I think it's quite telling. There's two things that really come to my mind to tell me that that's something that is he's thinking about a lot. Is when he had the now famous White House meeting with Vice President Vance and then President Zelensky from Ukraine, he said a couple of times, "You're gambling with millions of lives," and he said twice, "You're gambling with World War III." And then I think back to during the campaign when he did an online X interview with Elon Musk. And several times in that interview, it was like a 50-minute or an hour-long interview, he brought up, basically unprompted, nuclear weapons and nuclear war and the dangers of nuclear war. And I thought, and that he actually has brought up the Russia-China relationship unprompted a couple of times in other interviews. But I think nuclear war is one piece of this. He actually is very concerned, I think, about nuclear weapons and the potential of escalation over something like Ukraine going into a direction that is an uncontrollable situation. And I think that's actually a fear that sometimes I think the Biden administration was obviously worried about it. That's one of the reasons they calibrated their response. But there's an awful lot of people, and certainly in social media, and a lot of chest thumpers out there who seem to think that that's not a threat anymore. And I think that's borderline lunacy. Clearly, it's a threat, not just a threat of intentional actions, but a threat of accidental and actions born of misperception. And I think that very much is front and center for the president. And I think the second piece of it is the China relationship. I think he is under the impression that we've done a lot, the United States and in particular, to facilitate an embrace between Russia and China that they may never they weren't going to be enemies, and I don't or anything like that, but they didn't necessarily have to be so tight. And now with China being the key backer for Russia, essentially as it continues the war, that's a real challenge because now China gets cheap energy. It gets to buy stuff on the cheap from Russia. It gets the distraction of the United States and the West and Europe while China figures out exactly what it wants to do with Taiwan. So there's a lot of issues with Russia being too close to China. I think he intuitively understands that that's not a good situation.
And how do you see the new administration policy towards Europe, considering their goal is one to basically resolve the conflict in Ukraine, two to de-escalate or to at the very least to change the direction that the relations with Russia has been, and three, China is the prime challenge and target in terms of the threat. How is Europe fitting into those calculations? Are they considering it to be a partner, or are they considered to be a challenge to their policy? Actually,
I think they would like Europe to be a partner, but when they want Europe to be a partner, they mean an actual partner, not essentially a vassal who kind of manipulates the American taxpayer. That is their perception. Their perception so far is that presidents, and by the way, presidents of both parties, even Barack Obama, complained about Europe not spending in most of the European nations. Now, there's some distinctions here. Poland and the Baltics basically do meet, in fact, exceed most of their expectations as NATO members in terms of they've seriously exceeded the 2% of GDP on defense spending. That was the mark that people have talked about for years for NATO. Or for NATO members to spend. They've been doing it, and of course, they've been doing it because they're very close to Russia. But France, Germany, Italy, Spain, all these other countries, and especially Germany is probably the most prominent, Germany and France, they have not been, and they haven't been for years. And again, you go back in time, Barack Obama complained about this. Secretary of Defense for Obama, Robert Gates, gave a really good speech in like 2011 or 12, where he was basically almost prophesying what's now happened, where he said, you know, there's going to come a time when American voters are not going to support us over paying too much to defend you and essentially to help Europe build out their own social welfare states because they've kind of outsourced a lot of their defense to the United States. There's going to come a time where voters aren't going to be happy about that. So you need to do something now. That was over a decade ago, and that was well before Trump ever ran for president the first time. So this is a long-standing problem between the United States and Europe. You know, I think, and especially now as the United States seeks to pivot to Asia, it's something that even again Obama wanted to do, by the way. So if you see it, there's actually strikingly more continuity in some of this than I think a lot of people think. I think the biggest difference is that while Obama lamented it and ultimately sort of accepted that Europe was not spending adequately and they didn't want a rupture in the relationship over that. Trump has said, I'm willing to risk a rupture in the relationship to make the Europe pay more so that we can have a more equitable relationship, so that we can be partners and allies based on interests, much more so than values, but interests. But in order to do that, you have to spend more because we inevitably are going to be spending more in Asia because of the China challenge. And I think he's very blunt, he's very aggressive, he's very harsh. And certainly Senator or Vice President Vance has said that. That's another piece of this is there is a perception among a lot of the president and Vance's voting base that Europe is essentially a secular, overly secular, almost anti-Christian sort of perspective, which kind of informs a lot of the base of the Trump base. And there's a certain degree of resentment that we're spending a lot of money to protect people who basically don't like our own values. So you've got two problems that they've undersold. They've built welfare states with money they should have been spending on defense, and they don't even like our values anymore. So why are we protecting them? That is very much in mind there. So my sense is that what they really want is Europe to step up, spend more on defense, basically be the main counter or hedge with Russia to prevent any potential further Western aggression that Russia might have, while we shift more to Asia. And if they don't do it, we're not going to be the backstop anymore because why should we be? That is their perspective. And a lot of people disagree with that. I happen to think that's actually generally correct as a perspective from a purely American interest standpoint, because until Trump came along, Europe wasn't really taking it seriously. Now, all of a sudden, you got Germany trying to suspend their debt ceiling or their debt limitations and spend more. They've done more in the last several weeks since President Trump has been in office and pushing them than they've done in 3 years after Russia invaded Ukraine.
And it's fascinating because you raise a few topics here. So I wanna touch two of them. The first one is the change in the values, and I think that's a point that is completely missed when people talk about the U.S. change of foreign policy towards Europe. And I think that's a point also that was kind of missed in the vice president's speech in the Munich conference, when for a lot of people it was like he's interfering in domestic policy in Germany because he expressed their resentment about how some political parties, i.e., referring to the AfD, are not going to be part of the coalition because of the German political negotiations there. But what I'm seeing now from what you're saying is that basically you're saying we have our core values, i.e., family values, Christian values, and so on, that our voters voted for this administration to promote, and yet you are not sharing the same values. So for us, it's very hard to relate to you from this perspective, and it's kind of super interesting because until now, everybody just looked at it as kind of a bullish act by Vice President Vance coming to Germany, to Munich, to interfere, so to speak, in the elections, and that was very blunt, and in a way, it was interfering. But it also kind of explained the ideological. We're going back to the change in ideology. It explains the ideological context where this administration is coming from.
Hmm.
And I think that's fascinating. That's one. The second thing is, I think for the United States, having Europe as a strong fortress standing by its own also liberate them when it comes to engage in Russia, meaning that they don't have to take into consideration European concerns because Europe is strong enough so they can do their own thing when it comes to that. So I think those are two things that are kind of pushing the U.S. foreign policy. Would you agree with that? Would that be correct as cause statements?
Absolutely. And I think, and I do think this is really important to values. So I'll start with the values one because I think this is really important. And like I mentioned before, having spent some time with the vice president, again, he's a recent Catholic convert. He's very strong in his faith, and that does inform a lot of his worldview. So when he sees people being arrested for protesting outside an abortion clinic, that offends him on a very deep personal level as a pro-life uh, person who believes that life begins at conception. That faith really informs his moral framework and how he sees things. And I think it's offensive to a lot of Americans, certainly American conservatives, who are the biggest portion of Trump's base. When we had don't want to get too far down on domestic politics, but I think this is really an important one. There was what was called the Dobbs case in the United States several years ago with the U.S. Supreme Court that essentially overturned Roe v. Wade and turned the abortion issue back to states. And we don't need to get into all the jurisprudence of it, but that was something that a lot of conservatives had wanted for decades, and it was a huge deal. The Supreme Court nominees that President Trump put on the court essentially overturned Roe v. Wade, or from his first term, overturned Roe v. Wade. That was very important to a lot of conservatives. Uh, and we had European officials complaining about it. We had European officials hectoring America. Everybody's complaining about Senator or Vice President Vance going into Munich and complaining about Europe. We've had to listen to European leaders complain about us and talk about how we were violating human rights in America over the fact that we overturned abortion, where a lot of people think abortion is murder, from a moral, religious standpoint. Now, you can disagree with that, and people can disagree and be pro-life, pro-choice, but we've had to listen to moral lectures for a long time from the Europeans, the very people who then weren't paying their fair share for defense. Well, I think that what you're seeing is you're seeing a backlash against that from people who are like, whoa, you're spending money over there when you should be spending money getting those jobs back to Ohio in steel country that have been lost and have left gaping holes in communities that have been filled by fentanyl and death. You're spending money protecting those people instead of protecting your people. That is a real palpable thing here in Ohio, which is a major state. And that is what Trump and Vance are representing. And I do think that a lot of folks don't understand it because they haven't seen it firsthand here in the United States. It's a huge thing. And I think that what Vance was really doing was laying a marker out there on that.
And I want to touch on that point just to be more clear. How much is this administration, from that perspective you just mentioned, you just talked about, how much is this administration actually articulating the voice of their voters? Is that like basically, because a lot of times I hear people saying Trump is basically doing what he wants, but on the other hand, I'm thinking from talking to you, I understand that he's actually articulating what the voters actually want.
Well, I think so. He got voted. Essentially, he got elected on three big things, four things actually. Uh, First was the border. The second is restoring manufacturing. The third is being anti what we call woke here, the whole left sort of heavy racial, politics and things like that. And that's really been a very big issue. And don't get into stupid wars like we've been doing in the past, especially stupid wars that don't benefit the United States interests but benefit other people. Those are the four big planks of what Trump is doing. And actually, he's acting on all four of them. He's trying to stem illegal immigration. He is trying through the tariffs and through other policies to try to get manufacturing back. Whether it's successful or not is a question, of course, but that he's certainly trying to do that. He has gone after the woke stuff, which is a really big issue in American domestic American politics, with the kind of aggressiveness that we just haven't seen from the president. I mean, it's really aggressive and it's very popular amongst his base. And he is wanting to end wars that could escalate, which is, again, what he ran on when he called the Republicans and called George W. Bush stupid for the Iraq war and everything else. So he's doing that too. So in a sense, Some of the stuff is a little bit beyond what people would have expected. I don't think anybody was expecting the Greenland stuff or the bringing back the Panama Canal as a major discussion or Canada as the 51st state. There are definitely some quirks here that kind of fall into that whole what we were talking about earlier with McKinley, Polk, et cetera. That wasn't something I think a lot of people necessarily anticipated. I didn't anticipate that. But all this other stuff is very, very much in line with what he ran on, very much in line for why people voted for him, and he's doing it. In fact, in some ways, he's doing it as much as any president has done. I mean, Biden certainly tried to take care of his constituencies as well. I think one of the things that's hard for people outside America to understand is there's a very strong social conservative element in the United States that is not secular, that is not postmodern. And I think that Trump represents those people, and he is pursuing policies that those people like. And that's a good chunk of America.
And it's interesting we're talking about the voting and the constituencies, because one of the things that also drive Trump's policy, not in terms of the actions, but the speed and the fairness of those actions, is the fact that he doesn't have a lot of time. So for a lot of us that look at it from outside of the United States, we kind of look at it like he has 4 years. But if you look into internal domestic policies, and I think this is where you have an amazing point of view.
Less than
There's
two. He's got less than 2 years because we have
less
midterm.
than 2 years because he's basically entering the voting for Congress, right?
Hmm.
And for for those electives from the states. So how does that impact? How is that impacting his roadmap of decision making and understanding that? Like, is that something that basically is guiding him fundamentally, because he understands that the election may be over for the presidency, but you still have Congress to maintain with the majority that he has.
Absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because I think what's also expediting it is because he doesn't face reelection, he can afford to be bolder than he could have been, obviously, if he had to face reelection himself. So he wants to
Yeah,
be bolder now because he's got his own timeline and his time in office. But then you have that extra timeline that even shrinks the bar more because of the midterms. A lot of the stuff he's doing is through executive order, and just like the president before him, Biden, a lot of the executive orders that he's undone himself, and then the new ones, of course, he's put in, can be undone by a Democrat who gets into the White House. So you need Congress to codify these things, to put it into law, and that makes it obviously far more difficult to just undo. I mean, and that's the way the American government system is supposed to work anyway. There's a lot of questions about whether we're operating according to the constitutional constructs that we have, and I think there's a lot of internal debate about how that's operating in America for a long time. And I think there are some institutional decay issues. Another factor in I think Trump's rise is some of our own domestic institutional decay challenges. But he needs Congress. He needs Congress to make laws that can last. And if he loses it, we've got the Republicans have a very narrow majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. It would be very easy to see that flip. And that can flip because of state politics. So if you have a lot of backlash in the states and state legislators and governors, they actually draw the maps for Congress. So if you have a bunch of Republicans losing state legislatures and governorships, that could put Democrats in charge of the map making process, which can change the balance of power in Congress. The Senate is not so much because those are statewide elections, but in Congress, how the maps get drawn for the U.S. House of Representatives is dictated, but for the most part, by the states, not the federal government. And so
yeah.
you have that factor as well that plays a role. So you could have one state shift 2 seats from Republican to Democrat, and that could change the entire Congress. That could change who's the Speaker of the House. You know, so so that could happen in a blink, and because that's the election next year, 2026, and election season starts early all the time, earlier and earlier. So really, you've got 2 years, in some sense, even less, because election season kicks off, and good luck trying to pass substantive legislation in the middle of an election cycle. So by the time you're getting to May, June of next year, Congress is all those people are running for office back home.
And it seems to me that that's what basically is driving the priorities when it comes to him and his actions, because there's big topics such as Iran and China that are not being confronted, so to speak, at the same ferocity and at the same level of assertiveness as topics that relates to the internal domestic aspects related to, for example, the industrialization that we spoke about and bringing jobs. And that's why we see this stuff with the tariffs and tariffs as a leverage on immigration and so on. So it looks like that's what basically set the tone for those next 18 months or the next 12 months at least. Basically going with those kind of policies first and later deal with the bigger ones, which are more heavy, so to speak, but are not as important domestically. So they might be very important on the international. Putting that, there is one exception, which is the Ukraine war. And that is what I wanted to reach to and talk to you about that. So for a lot of people looking at that press conference that we saw with Zelensky in the Oval Office, and I know for a lot of Trump supporters, it was hard to watch. It was a hard scene to watch, but and what followed afterwards, the so-called embargo, I wouldn't say embargo, but cease to assist of intelligence sharing and weapon in order to basically push Zelensky into Saudi Arabia negotiations, into the negotiations taking place in Saudi Arabia. What's the driver there that the administration is looking, that is pushing the administration looking into the conflict of basically saying, we want to finish it soon? Because it looks like there's some kind of a hurry with it, knowing that it might place into Russia's hands. But they're still pushing full steam ahead with let's finish with this conflict, let's reach a settlement. So, what is the driver that is pushing this motivation, this behavior?
Well, I think it's a couple of things we talked about before. I think the president actually is worried about escalation. I think he is very concerned that Russia's got a lot of nuclear weapons and bad things can happen, and I think he really does seriously have that as a concern. I think the second thing is he does want to repair Russian relations, broadly speaking, partly for the geopolitical context with China and on. I think he wants it to stabilize the escalation threat, and he wants to be able to. I think he may want to try to peel Russia all the way away from China. I don't think that's a very likely scenario, but I do think it's a potential scenario that Russia gets a little bit looser in the embrace with China, and I think that has geopolitical benefits all of its own. I think the president wants to see that. So I think, in a sense, I think he sees Ukraine as a distraction from the bigger picture. And I think for American interest, frankly, it is. I mean, not to be weird about it, but I mean, Ukraine is not as important to the United States geopolitics and all as it is for Europe. It's not our backyard; it's Europe's backyard. And if Europe were to step up sufficiently on its own defense, given the fairly poor performance that Russia has done in conventional warfare and the slog that it's been at, the idea that Russia is going to go marching into Warsaw or marching into Berlin or something like that, I think to a lot of Americans seems pretty fanciful. Now, that's easier again for us to say because we have the Atlantic Ocean there. And Zelensky actually made that point. And that was actually the point, though, that ticked off Trump, because if you look at where the meeting really spiraled, it started with the vice president, but it really, the whole thing about I've got the cards, you don't have the cards, all that kind of stuff with the conversation there was when Zelensky said, well, you got an ocean, but you're going to feel it at some point. And Trump was basically saying, no, not really. We're probably not going to not feel it like you do. And so don't tell us that. And I think that was a, and just from geopolitics 101, it's kind of true. I mean, from a values, you can kind of separate the values position from the strategic assessment. The strategic assessment has to be Russia is way weaker than people anticipated. And now you could argue that if they got all of Ukraine, that would build them back up. Of course, you'd have labor, you'd have more natural resources. But I think what this has shown a lot of folks in America is that Russia's not as strong. It's what is it? I can't remember if Churchill said this or someone said something to the effect that Russia is never as strong as it looks, nor as weak as it looks. So it's always somewhere there in the perennial middle of people's perceptions. And I think possibly Trump may underestimate how dangerous Russia could be in that sense, but he doesn't see it as the challenge. It's mostly a European problem, and we need to not risk escalation, and we need to find a way to start working with Russia on the China question. And Ukraine is a huge impediment to that.
Would you say that there were voices inside the Trump supporters camp that saw what happened with Zelensky and it kind of unraveled the boat a little bit, or would you say that's something that pretty much represented the voters base that Trump has, and it kind of reflected that mindset?
I think that there are some people who signed, who ultimately voted for the president that didn't like Biden, didn't like the inflation, didn't like some of the woke domestic policy stuff, that voted for Trump as an alternative to that, but aren't necessarily hardcore Trump supporters. I think to folks who are in that camp, the Zelensky meeting definitely rattled their cage. In some sense, some of those folks also are probably being rattled by the tariffs and the stock markets too, because they weren't hard Trump supporters. They just didn't like the alternative. They did not like Harris at all. Uh, but I would say that if you are a hardcore Trump supporter who supported him since the beginning, the Zelensky meeting was actually good. People liked it, actually. I mean, a lot of his supporters actually appreciated that Trump did it. They liked him smacking Zelensky down the way he did. So actually, a lot of his supporters loved it.
And one more topic, just because we're reaching the end, there's so much to cover here, yeah. But um, one of the topics that we saw the Trump administration, one of the first decisions they made was basically kind of closing down or shutting down, I would say, shutting down the USID program office, and one that for many years has been working. Now there's a lot of back and forth about it, a lot of I would say ideological concerns regarding that. But in essence, why do you think it was so important for the Trump administration to shut down the USID?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. We haven't talked on Doge and Elon Musk, and that's a
Yeah.
whole other big issue in American politics. Government overreach, government bureaucracy, overspending. These are big issues in domestic American politics, and Trump has certainly attacked that with vigor through Musk. And this was certainly a portion of that. Uh, I think there is a perspective by most Americans that we don't need to spend any money on foreign aid. Because most Americans are fairly don't think about foreign policy all that much, except when they're forced to. So that, and I think they also think that we spend a lot more on foreign aid than we actually do. So I think there's a perception that by cutting this, you're somehow addressing the national debt issue. That's actually not true at all, not really. And U.S. aid and U.S. foreign aid is a blip on the radar. I mean, it's almost infinitesimally small compared to the issues that are driving the U.S. national debt, which is a big issue. But the other factor is this woke stuff. The woke, when I keep talking about that, that is a big, big issue. You can't understate how big an issue that is to a lot of the conservative voters that make up Trump's hardcore base, and the perception that this organization was not necessarily just going out to do what it was doing in the Cold War to sort of undermine Soviets and defend human rights, but was teaching people to, transgender ideology, which is very controversial in America, and that this is what you're spending your money on, as opposed to real things, that you're conflating that with human rights. A lot of people don't believe that in Trump's coalition. And so they think that that is wasted money, and essentially money that goes to nonprofits that are basically run by people who want to impose a woke kind of almost revolutionary social agenda. So they really kind of resent that. So when they trotted out a lot of these things that USAID was spending on that seemed kind of silly, it wasn't just that it was silly or wasteful. It was that it was actually counterproductive, because it was actually promoting values that a lot of people find antithetical to their own. So it became a huge, huge issue and a lightning rod for a lot of the social disputes that we have.
But this is where it's very interesting, because the USID, at the end of the day, most of the money goes for development, for health programs, for actually doing a lot of good stuff, which one can say actually helps the United States with, for example, aspects related to health, public health in areas where public health is not reachable, actually helps to reduce the risks of spreading of disease and so on, and a lot of other stuff. It's the civil society stuff that got all the
Yep.
attention, right? I think a lot of the color, so to speak, that was painted to it was about that woke stuff, but a lot of the civil society is about teaching about democracy and democratic values and so on, which I think for some in the U.S. administration, that was something that they reject, because they're saying we should not be teaching democracy anywhere. It's not our role to kind of tell other people or other what's going on in other people's backyard. It's not our role to interfere. And there was a lot of critique back then at the campaigns that the Clinton administration was doing during Putin's elections and stuff like that, which kind of triggered him, even though it wasn't as massive as people make it look. It was quite menial, but just the fact that symbolically it was there to some extent. So my question here is, how much of a component of the ideology, of the Trump administration ideology, is related to the idea of we don't need civil society movements, and we don't want to have civil society programs, not via USAID or via others. How much of a critical component is that in their foreign policy, in the foreign policy ideology and doctrine?
I think you're actually going to start to see it become a bigger role and a shift in thinking. When he was still senator, Vance spoke to. He said something that I think is kind of telling. He said, when China goes into Africa, they don't come with a lecture; they come with money and infrastructure. And the critique he was essentially making is, we come with all these strings attached, and we tell people you got to do this, and we'll go into, for example, a conservative society in Africa that might be conservative Muslim or conservative Christian, which is obviously a good chunk of Africa is one or the other, and we'll come in with a bunch of essentially more secularized ideas and telling them they have to do this, and you don't get you don't get the aid if you don't toe these social policy lines. And Vance was very critical of that. And I think his view was, if we're going to go and do aid, it should be something that we can get a direct benefit for, or do direct competition to counter Chinese influence from an economic standpoint, but that the social stuff, we shouldn't be promoting essentially secularized stuff. And I think that is what you're starting to see. I would imagine that as time goes on, there's going to be more strategic desires to build infrastructure, to do things of that nature, things that are more, it'll be difficult to do because we obviously don't run things like China does, but more belt and roadish, if you will, or economic corridors and things like that, with a lot less human rights and those kind of strings attached. I think you will see some of that, but it's going to be far more. Frankly, it'll be more like what China does, as opposed to what America's historically done. I think that's the Trump vision, because their view is, we don't want to be to some extent, they don't support some of those very values that were being put out there, because they think that they are poor values, actually.
Mhm.
So why should we be putting that and foisting that on other countries? And then at the same time we're doing that, we're making them sometimes not like some of the stuff we do when we foist that on them as a condition of getting aid. So why not just give them the aid and be just blunt about it and make it a kind of a quid pro quo sort of situation?
Hmm. That's fascinating, because until now, I think my perspective was that this is basically to put on hold the whole idea of foreign aid, from that kind of an ideological point of view. But what you're saying here is that it actually could be a change in the way foreign aid is being delivered, not from the perspective of a value oriented one to promote certain values, civil society, and so on, but from an economic oriented one, i.e., the Road and Belt Initiative, like the Chinese does, which is basically providing countries with economic aid, and in programs such as infrastructure or whatever it is that helps them on the economic side, that will, in the end of the day, also make your serve your economic interest, which is why the Chinese are doing it. They're doing it because it serves their economic interest. There's no values attached to it, except basically to increase trade, or to help the increasing of trade for the benefit of China. So I think that's a very interesting kind of a way to look at it, and it's a massive change. So with that, we're out of time. And again, I said before, this is one of those conversations we can do for another 3-4 hours easily. There's so many topics we probably didn't cover. There's a lot of I would say topics here that we talked about that were both enlightening, but also I would say provocative, mind provocative, and I think that's good. And I'm sure people who will listen to it, will have opinions, like anything that has the name Trump on it. There's always some opinions to the left, to the right, to the up, to the down, but there's always going to be some opinion of someone about this. So, Greg, thank you so much for participating in this discussion, for your insights. I have to say that I find it very enlightening, very insightful, also to speak to someone who comes from inside the U.S., from the perspective of understanding also the domestics elements of it. And I think that was very insightful to hear that. So thank you so much, Greg, for this. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful opportunity, and I was glad to do it.